UFC Fight Night, Derrick Lewis versus Sergey Spivak. Welcome to your full card prediction video presented by yours truly here at Boxing MMA Picks. Harris flying solo again, but as usual, we're going to be giving you these fight-by-fight breakdowns and analysis from that betting perspective. I want to let you know which fights are worth the value, which fights to avoid, which underdog has the best shot at winning, and some parlay action towards the end of the video as well. Make sure you hit the thumbs up on this video. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel here at Boxing MMA Picks. Share it with a friend. Share it with anyone that you know that is looking to get some advice for this UFC Fight Night event. And most importantly, we want to hear from you in the comments. For this UFC Fight Night, again, Derrick Lewis versus Sergey Spivak. We have 12 fights overall. 5 of them are on the main card. 7 of them are on our prelims. And getting started with fight number 1 of the prelims, we have Natália Silva taking on Tereza Bledá. Natália Silva beat Jasmine Jasudavicius in her June debut. She's introduced as a Taekwondo fighter. She's a southpaw, really light on her feet, fights from the outside. Technique definitely looks improved in her last fight compared to the 2.5-year layoff she took before that. She's very young as well. I think she's only 25 years old. So that amount of time completely revamped her game. She has a kick-heavy game, uses those side kicks for additional distance control. Her last fight showed that she has really good power and speed with the hands specifically as well. Really good lateral movement, good constant movement. She showed good takedown defense as well in her debut. She showed good balance. She showed good IQ in terms of defending that takedown. She also landed 2 takedowns of her own in that last fight. Also has 7 submission victories to her name amongst her 13 victories. So she's showing that she has a complete side to her game. And especially in her last fight, I was really impressed with her cardio. Again, a lot of movement. Natália Silva is somebody who could be a legitimate prospect in this flyweight division. Maybe a bit too small. Might be better served at strawweight, but competing in the flyweight division for now. And again, looking pretty decent, at least in her last fight. Tereza Bledá, on the other hand, she's an undefeated newcomer. She has a win in Dana White Contender Series back in September, so not too long ago. She's staying active. She has a good long jab, clean striking, patient striking, has good takedowns, good timing on her takedowns as well. She has good ground and pound, good top control, bit vulnerable to submission attempts in the scramble, though. Solid overall as a prospect in her own right. I'll keep the predictions short. I like Natália Silva here. I feel like she might be better everywhere. Maybe I'm too oversold on her last performance, but I feel like she has the ability to potentially be more effective everywhere in this fight. Maybe except wrestling, which isn't too far off. I think about Silva being a lot quicker on the feet, more movement, in my opinion, more dangerous striking. I think Bledá will have a hard time with Silva's movement. She's somebody who's a bit more technical, a bit slower with respect to her style of striking. I do think Natália Silva can fend off the takedown attempts if they are attempted, I should say, by Tereza Bledá. And I think that Silva could potentially land takedowns of her own if she looks for it. If Bledá does get her down, I'm not saying Natália Silva's Kamaru Usman by any means in terms of her takedown defense, but if Bledá is able to get Silva down, I do believe that Silva can use her grappling knowledge to scramble her way back up. So good matchup to get us started, but I'm going to side with Natália Silva as the -170 favorite. I feel decently good about it. Relatively low level fight, so I'm not going to be too quick to throw this on a parlay, but again, something to keep in mind. I do think Natália Silva could be more effective essentially everywhere in this fight. Fight number 2, we're looking at Brady Hiestand versus Fernie Garcia. Brady Hiestand had a split decision loss to Ricky Turcios last year in August. That was the Ultimate Fighter finale. He's still just 23 years old. It's been 15 months since that last fight versus Ricky Turcios. So sort of similar to Natália Silva in some ways, we see young fighters taking time off, that could be a good thing. That could be a sign that revamping of the game is coming. If we're looking at Brady Hiestand as he currently is, serviceable stand up, aggressive, comes forward, not afraid to throw that big shot. He's much more of a wrestler, though. Good entries, good takedown attempts, good takedowns in general. He landed 6 takedowns in that last fight versus Ricky Turcios. Good top control, good ground and pound to go along with it, good at improving position. But with that wrestling pace, we see this often. Lousy cardio, right? Lousy cardio. He showed that in his last fight. That could be a legitimate concern. But with respect to the cardio, whereas Brady Hiestand's last opponent, Ricky Turcios, I feel like Turcios had that aggression, had that pace in his striking, had a bit of a clinch in his own, of his own, I should say, had the grappling as well to combat Brady Hiestand's takedown heavy style, wrestling heavy style. I don't really feel like Fernie Garcia has that. Fernie Garcia had a unanimous decision loss to Journey Newson back in May. That was his debut. Good quick hands, quick combinations, solid counter puncher, sneaky pop too. Only has one TKO victory amongst his 10 wins, but again, has some pretty solid power from what we're seeing. He should be the fighter coming forward, or at least he tries to. Not too much pressure though. He could do a better job at keeping the hands active as he tries to press forward. But even with advantageous ring position, the hands just aren't too active. What really could be costly here for Fernie Garcia is that he has just 57% takedown defense. He was taken down twice in his debut. That's definitely something that you want to note, because we do believe that Brady Hiestand will attempt that takedown heavy style. And like I mentioned, whereas Ricky Turcios had the aggression to counter that, had the pace to counter that, had the clinch, had the submissions, or grappling knowledge, I should say, to counter that. I don't really feel like Fernie Garcia has that to respond with. I think that this is a favorable matchup for Brady Hiestand, and I think he'll successfully be able to land takedowns in at least 2 rounds. I also think that Hiestand can, be more effective at putting on pressure, at being in your face. Whereas with Fernie Garcia's inactive style, even if he tries to come forward, like I said, there's really no activity that follows along with it. And I don't think he has the IQ to adjust the game plan in the middle of the fight. This is a relatively low level fight, so we know that anything can happen. I mean, Fernie Garcia can very much use his striking, land combinations, potentially hurt Brady Hiestand. We saw Turcios drop Brady Hiestand in that fight. And again, Hiestand has that questionable cardio, and we know the striking defense gets a lot worse when your cardio is out the door. So Fernie Garcia can very much win with his striking. Low level fight, anything can happen. But I do think that Brady Hiestand will be able to implement the takedowns. I think he'll be able to have the control time that he's looking for on the ground. And I think that he's going to be able to lock at least 2 rounds in his favor. So look for Brady Hiestand to get into the win column with this one. I can see why he is a slight favorite. He's going to be my pick for this fight. But again, be careful because this is a relatively low level fight and anything can happen. Fight number 3, Vanessa Demopoulos versus Maria Oliveira. Vanessa Demopoulos is on a 2-fight winning streak after a split decision win versus Jinyu Fry back in June. She's introduced as a jiu-jitsu and a Muay Thai style fighter, aggressive, high-paced striker. She likes to come forward. She likes to engage. She has those decent low kicks as well. She's been in many 5-round fights, so I'm just not concerned about her cardio whatsoever. Striking wise, she leaves herself a bit open. She doesn't really have the best striking defense. She's a little bit more on the brawling side of things as opposed to the technical side of things with respect to her striking. Her strength is in her jiu-jitsu. She is a high-level grappler. The only problem with that is kind of Mackenzie Dernish, not comparing the grappler, but what I am comparing is that I wouldn't really consider Vanessa Demopoulos to be the strongest wrestler. So she may have issues landing the takedown, bringing the fight to the mat. She has just 1 takedown landed in 4 UFC fights thus far. And that's not really a good sign when your specialty is being on the ground, your specialty is grappling. But she's on a 2-fight win streak, so she's making it work. Vanessa Demopoulos had a split decision win over Gloria De Paula back in June. That was definitely a close fight. Oliveira is very comfortable on the feet. She has a Muay Thai style. She can be explosive early in the fight, and I think she's an early fight threat. She uses her jab to keep the fight at distance. She's going to have a 10-inch reach advantage in this one, which is a lot and which will allow her to keep the fight at distance for as long as she needs to. She has a decent calf kick. She uses those push kicks as well for further distance control. Good consistent level of activity. She's not afraid to engage, so expect a lot of explosive combinations from her, again, at least early on in the fight, because she does start to slow down, right? And as she slows down, it's a lot more fighting from the outside. The explosiveness slows down, of course. The activity slows down too, which is a little concerning. So you definitely want to watch out for that. Ultimately, for this fight, we're looking at the odds here. Demopoulos is a slight underdog. Oliveira is a slight favorite. I think at this point, I see that they are a pick'em on different lines as well. So money might be coming in on Demopoulos. Ultimately, I'm going to trust the intangibles on the side of Vanessa Demopoulos a bit more for this fight. I am expecting a close fight. I am expecting a split decision type of fight. I mean, both of these women were in split decision wins in their last fight. So it lets you know, how often they get themselves in close situations. I think that Vanessa Demopoulos' cardio holds up a lot better. And I think that's going to give her the edge in rounds 2 and round 3. I think Maria Oliveira has given up takedowns in each of her 3 UFC fights, and that could be another thing that Demopoulos can capitalize on, can sort of use as a blueprint, as a game plan. And like we saw in that Jin Yu Fry fight, to that point of game planning, I think Demopoulos is reliable, or at least more reliable, from that IQ perspective, to go for a takedown in a close round, to go for a takedown, to try to get that clinch against the cage if it's kind of 50-50 leading up to that point. Maria Oliveira has just 46% takedown defense, and ultimately, I think that's going to be what costs her the decision. So Vanessa Demopoulos is going to be my pick. I think she's going to get it done. Better IQ, better cardio. The ground game could be an advantage of hers as well. But I am expecting a very close fight. Vanessa Demopoulos, the underdog, is going to be my pick, though. Fourth fight of our prelims, we're looking at Ricky Turcios taking on Kevin Natividad. For Turcios, unanimous decision loss to Alamin Zahabi back in July. Striking is okay. Switch stance, decent calf kick. Hands are a bit wild. He throws a lot of kicks just in general. Put combinations together. He is better when he's coming forward. He throws a lot of fakes and feints along the way. He'll shoot for takedowns, has a solid clinch. If he's taken down, he does have a decent guard. He will try to do some work off of his back. And, he is able to scramble to make his way back up. I don't think that'll be too relevant for this fight, but that is sort of a good to know. I don't know what it is about Ricky Turcios, though, but just doesn't really offer me much at this UFC level. I think his style is predicated on high pace, constant pace, but when it comes to skill, toughness, game plan, it's just not there for me. Thankfully for Ricky Turcios, this is a low-level fight in general, and he's taking on a relatively low-level opponent in Kevin Natividad, who hasn't really fought since April of last year. So we're looking at a year and a half since his last fight. He lost to Bledá at that time. Kevin Natividad fights from the outside. He has good movement, good in and out movement, good striking speed. He's very fast. He's very explosive. He has good takedown defense as well, so expect him to keep it standing, kind of a sprawl and brawl type of thing. But the brawling part is a lot more fighting from the outside. Just doesn't really have the work rate, though, at least in the past. Just hasn't really put punches together. We look at the significant strikes landed per minute at just 2.63. I'm curious to see if this is still an issue for him a year and a half later. Again, another low-level fight on this card. I think that's kind of the theme of this card. So we know that anything can happen. And that kind of makes for a lot more difficult of a card to predict. But I'm going to side with the underdog. I'm going to side with Kevin Natividad on this. I feel like Natividad's striking can be more effective. I feel like it's a bit better technically, especially with the hands. Again, Natividad does that kind of sprawl and brawl type of style. So I can see him fending off those takedowns from Ricky Turcios, fighting from the outside. And simply put, I really just don't believe in Ricky Turcios at this level. So I'm going to go with the underdog. Kevin Natividad is going to be my pick. Fight number 5 of our prelims, we're looking at Vince Morales versus Miles Johns. Miles Johns lost to John Castaneda back in February. Decent on the feet, good jab, good power, a lot of fakes and feints to set up that power. He is primarily boxing. He'll throw the occasional calf kick here and there. Decent movement, fights from range, fights from the outside. He does back up a bit too much for my liking. He's not really too active either. I mean, we look at that striking rate, and it's just not the highest. He's a lot more effective when he is the one putting on the pressure, when he is increasing his output and his combinations. He has the ability to do that, but again, just in terms of his habits, just not really active and fights too much from the outside for my liking. He has good wrestling when he chooses to do so. You look at the numbers there, less than a takedown per fight, though. It's not something that he resorts to often in his fights. It looks like he prefers the striking. Cardio, definitely a problem with Miles Johns. I mean, he looked super gassed halfway through the second round before being finished in the early part of the third. If you look at that last fight versus John Castaneda, and I don't think it was the highest pace leading up to that. So that could be a real concern for Miles Johns. He's going up against Vince Morales, who had a unanimous decision loss to Jonathan Martinez back in May. He's introduced as a wrestler, boxing style on the feet in terms of his striking, a lot of head movement, a lot of level changes, a lot of in and out, decent lateral movement to go along with it. He does switch stance a lot, so he can give you different looks. He has a solid right hand, has good power to go along with it. You look at his 11 wins, 6 of them are via KO, TKO. I mentioned that he's introduced as a wrestler. What's interesting is that he only has 1 takedown in 7 UFC fights at this point. I don't put too much stock into him being introduced as a wrestler, but again, I like to pay attention to that because that could speak to his knowledge, his IQ with respect to wrestling. Miles Johns' style, it makes him really prone to losing rounds because he's just not active enough, right? He looks for that one big shot. He takes a while to warm up. He takes a while to set it up. In some ways, the same could be said of Vince Morales, though, right? He fights from the outside. He's pretty inactive as well. So I'm looking at a fight that I'm maybe not going to enjoy, but I am looking at a fight that probably sets up pretty well for Miles Johns to pull through. Miles Johns has the bigger power, in my opinion. I think he has the more explosive power, in my opinion. And in a fight where neither guy is too active, I think it's going to allow both of them to not have too much cardio concerns. And I also think it's going to give Miles Johns the time that he needs to set up that big shot. Not confident at all in this one, though. I've been going back and forth as to who I think could win, and I truly think that anybody could win. From a betting perspective, I'd recommend staying away from this one completely. Both of these fighters are unreliable, right? So I wouldn't be, counting on any of them to win me any parlays. But from making a pick perspective, I still got to make a pick. You put a gun to my head, I'm going to go with Miles Johns on this one. I think that, again, bigger power, cardio might not be as much of a concern in a slower paced fight. And I think that sets up well for Miles Johns to get it done. Let's look at fight number 6. We have Jennifer Maia versus Myra Moroz. Good fight here in the women's flyweight division. Jennifer Maia's on a 2-fight losing streak. She lost to Manon Fiorot back in March. She's introduced as a Muay Thai kickboxer, decent boxing technique. She has good hands, good power, definitely comfortable on the feet, and not afraid to engage. She's physically strong. She's tough. She has that good clinch game, good knees in the clinch, good ground game as well. Despite the lack of takedown numbers, if she is on top, she has decent control on top. She has active enough ground and pound as well to really score, rounds in her favor or just time on top in her favor. Doesn't really have the best takedown defense, just 55%. I mentioned her ground IQ, though she is active on her back for what it's worth. She doesn't just stay on her back, give it up, lose the round, try again. She does, try to make her way back up, scramble, stays active, etc. And her cardio holds up amongst all of that. Jennifer Maia is tough. I mean, she's been at the top of this division for a while. This is a tough opponent that she's taking on in Maryna Moroz, who is on a 3-fight winning streak after she beat Maria Agapova back in March. For Moroz, clean technical striking, good head movement, good in and out movement, good level changes as well. She's pretty light on her feet. She has a good jab. She has a good 1-2 combination, and she's really effective at sort of implementing her style on the feet. She has good pop on her punches. She has good consistent pressure. She's confident on the feet, and it's very evident in her game. She has an improved ground game. She's a little bit more intentional with that ground game as well. You're looking at the numbers there, maybe not too impressed by them. 3/4 of a takedown per fight, just 22% accuracy. But again, especially in her last fight, she showed a more intentional ground game, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. I'm potentially looking at this fight in a similar way to Claudio Puelles versus Dan Hooker last week on the Adesanya Pereira pay-per-view card. I'm thinking about Dan Hooker, the established high-level veteran who's on a losing streak. That's Jennifer Maia, taking on a lower level of competition, not in a disrespectful way, but in a way where we have to look at who her last opponents have been. But taking on a lower level of competition in Maryna Moroz, I should say, the Claudio Puelles equivalent in this one, even though Claudio Puelles or even though Maryna Moroz has looked really good lately and has a perfect chance to prove themselves, right? A fighter that has looked good in their last few fights. So I'm looking at kind of similar parallels here, but this one is a lot tougher this week. This is a lot more of a 50-50 fight in my eyes. I think Moroz has the cleaner striking, but Jennifer Maia has the power and the toughness advantage. I think either fighter statistically can be taken down. What's interesting is that both fighters have a bit of a ground game, but both fighters definitely prefer to strike. So it's going to be interesting to see how much of this fight occurs in the stand-up, how much of this fight occurs on the ground. The Moroz versus Bueno Silva fight, Mayra Bueno Silva, that gave me a little bit of a blueprint, a slight blueprint for how this fight can go. I think about Bueno Silva being the fighter coming forward. I think about Moroz being the fighter fighting from the outside. I can see a similar dynamic in this one. Moroz was the quicker striker with quicker footwork and quicker movement in that fight. I can see a similar thing here. Bueno Silva landed the good, clean, big strikes, and I can see a similar thing here. Filling in Bueno Silva's name for Jennifer Maia. But as I go back and forth on this fight, first of all, I feel like it's 50-50. So that's important to notice because Jennifer Maia is the underdog at plus 160. Maryna Moroz is the favorite at minus 190. So it's important to mention that I do think this is a 50-50 fight. I was on Maia for a little bit. I might be even thinking dog or pass. But the more that I think about how this fight could go, I'm seeing it differently than Puelles versus Dan Hooker. I can't think of an example right now, but maybe Arnold Allen versus Calvin Kattar, where it's, again, the proven high-level vet on a couple of losses versus the younger, unproven fighter with something to prove that has looked good lately. It could be maybe more of that dynamic and less of a Claudio Puelles versus Dan Hooker dynamic. Ultimately, I'm landing on Maryna Moroz. I don't know why I can't get her name right to get to pull through here. My reason for that is I mentioned she's more intentional with the ground game. She's landed 4 takedowns in her last 2 fights. Both of those were against strikers. So it seems like she understands how to game plan and put herself in the best position to win. I also think she will be more likely of the two to land the takedowns, to actually attempt takedowns. Again, just with the way she's been a little bit more intentional on including that lately. Also, again, the striking, a little bit faster on the feet, a little bit quicker. I think those could potentially pose problems for Jennifer Maia. And this could be, I don't want to call it a passing of the guard. I mean, Moroz is still, she's only 3 years younger. But in terms of UFC experience, this could be kind of a passing of the guards from that perspective. So good opportunity for Maryna Moroz, and I think she's going to pull it off. Maryna Moroz is going to be my pick. And finally, the final fight of our prelims, we're looking at Charles Johnson versus Zhalgas Zhumagulov. Good fight here, good flyweight fight to end off our prelims. Zhumagulov, two-fight losing streak after a split decision loss to Jeff Molina back in June. He's a decent fighter, but 1-4 now in the UFC. Definitely fighting for his job. I mentioned this in his last fight. He lost that fight. He's back again. 1-4 now. You imagine if he goes 1-5 with 3 losses in a row, it won't fare too well for him. So gonna expect a little bit of desperation from him. That X factor could mean something for this fight. But outside of that, like I said, Zhalgas Zhumagulov, solid fighter, decent stand-up, decent kickboxing, decent boxing as well. Good movement. He can switch stance. He has good grappling, good wrestling to go along with it. 1.5 takedowns per. Landed 2 takedowns in his last fight, so it lets you know that he uses it regular enough, although I wouldn't call him a smothering wrestler by any means. And he's going to use decent stand-up to set it up. Decent pressure to set it up. He'll shoot for those takedowns. Again, looks like he's just game planning it and including it in his offense a little bit more. Fights off that back foot a little bit too much for me, though, especially as the fight progresses. It's something that he was doing a lot of, but in his last fight, he was starting to incorporate that forward pressure. But as the fight goes on, you kind of fall back on your old habits, and he starts to fight off of that back foot, almost looking like he's in retreat mode. But really good cardio, doesn't slow down at all. So look for him to be consistent, just as consistent in the 30 as he is in the first. Charles Johnson, on the other hand, lost his debut to Muhammad Mokaev. Switch stance, Muay Thai approach on the feet. He's patient, fights from the outside, a lot of feints, good head movement, solid movement overall. He has good regular usage of his jab, good regular usage of the calf kick. He's a composed striker, picks his shots really effectively. He can put clean combinations together as well. He was taken down several times in his debut, and as a result, I mean, his numbers are just going to be wonky, right? He didn't really get a chance to get started with the striking. I will touch on that later. He was taken down several times, but I mean, we know the type of opponent that his last opponent was, Muhammad Mokaev, relentless wrestler. He did show good takedown defense overall, in my opinion. Even when he was taken down, he was able to get up right away. Just couldn't get Mokaev off of him. Couldn't get an opportunity to breathe, to reset, to relax, to try to implement his game. His cardio is definitely there, though, which is a good thing. I look at Charles Johnson as a high IQ, intentional striker. I think that he will be able to adjust his game plan accordingly better than Zhumagulov will be able to do. Like I mentioned, Charles Johnson just never had the opportunity to get started in that Mokaev fight. I think this fight versus Zhumagulov presents him that opportunity to do so. But to that point, Zhumagulov can resort to the takedowns as well, right? We saw Mokaev do it. Zhumagulov can very much do it as well. It'll be interesting to see how much he refers to it, given that Zhumagulov is just as capable with his striking, and maybe prefers the striking more in a lot of different situations. Another close fight. Again, I think that's the theme of this card here, is that we're looking at a lot of close fights. This to me is a 50-50 fight in a lot of ways. I think there's reasons to believe that either fighter can pull it out. But I do believe that Charles Johnson will be the fighter that does end up pulling it out. And I think about Zhumagulov's last opponent, Jeff Molina. Jeff Molina had good movement. Jeff Molina was the crafty striker. I think that Johnson may currently be at a higher level than Jeff Molina by comparison when you're just comparing those attributes, or at least an equal level in terms of those attributes. Again, the movement, being crafty as a striker, being a little bit unpredictable as well. I think Johnson, like I said, at least an equal level, and that tells me that Zhumagulov is going to be outstruck in this fight, even though he may land a takedown or two. If you look at the statistics for that Molina versus Zhumagulov fight, I can see very similar statistics here. I think it was something like Molina landing 100 strikes, Zhumagulov landing 60 strikes, but Zhumagulov landing 2 takedowns versus Molina landing 0. I can see something similar to that where Zhumagulov gets a takedown or two, but otherwise Charles Johnson finds his way up fairly easily, and or Zhumagulov doesn't do too much with it on the ground, in addition to, again, Charles Johnson outstriking Zhalgas Zhumagulov. So Charles Johnson is going to be my pick, but this is definitely a close fight. So you want to be careful, might want to feel it out come face-off time and make your pick then. Let's move on to the main card where we have 5 fights, as I mentioned. We're looking at fight number 1 of the main card, Della, Maddalena versus Danny Roberts. I'll keep this prediction short. I'm going with Della all the way on this one. He's a big favorite for a reason. Della beat Ramazan Ameev back in June. He's on a 12-fight winning streak now after losing, his pro debut. Clean striking, good jab, solid combinations. The movement is clean. He has a judo background, so that'll speak to some of that clinch ability, potential takedown situations as well. In addition to the judo background, he has good wrestling IQ. So we saw, good scramble situations and even some submission defense in his last fight. Good power as well. 10 of his 12 wins are via KO, TKO, so watch out for that. Danny Roberts, on the other hand, lost to Francisco Trinaldo back in May. He's a striker, southpaw. Going to do a lot of that striking from the outside, moves decently well too. Good jab, good kicks. He's going to maintain that wide stance to try to avoid the wrestling threat, but to that point, just 57% takedown defense, so he is pretty vulnerable there. Willing to clinch and willing to get in close. You look at his record there, 18 wins, a number of knockouts on his resume as well, but 4 of those knockouts specifically started in situations where with knees in the clinch, right? So he is very dangerous in that position. I think about Danny Roberts' last fight versus Francisco Trinaldo. I think that's a good barometer of what to expect here, right? Trinaldo was controlling the center. Trinaldo was putting pressure. Trinaldo had bigger striking moments. Trinaldo was the tougher fighter. Trinaldo was better on the ground when it applied. I can see the same thing happening here, except Della is a lot faster than Trinaldo. He's a lot more active than Trinaldo. He's a lot more controlled with his striking than Trinaldo. He throws more combinations than Trinaldo. So I'm expecting a wider margin of victory than the split decision win that Trinaldo was able to get over Danny Roberts. Like I said, I started with my pick for this fight. I feel pretty comfortable with Della Maddalena here. He's a big favorite for a reason. I'm looking at this as a parlay piece. He might be better everywhere, if not more effective everywhere. So I'm looking for Della Maddalena to get the job done. Let's move on to our second fight of our main card, Andre Fialho versus Muslim Salikhov. For Salikhov, he lost to Jingliang Li back in July. Getting up there in age now, 38 years old. He has good boxing, decent footwork. He's not the fastest, but he is pretty light on the feet, stays out of range. Kicks are solid too as a kickboxer. Good power, 11 TKOs amongst those 18 victories that he has. Good IQ in the stand-up as well. He doesn't brawl. He doesn't waste energy, but he can engage if needed. So not afraid to do so. A lot of fakes and feints. He sets things up very well. He likes that spinning kick. Doesn't really engage proactively, though. His work rate just isn't the highest, which is always a problem when you're betting on someone, and not really a takedown specialist. He has the ability, which is interesting, but he just doesn't resort to it. 6 takedowns landed in 7 UFC fights. Again, good takedown ability, good IQ. He probably will land it at some point, but it is just not an active part of his game plan. Very much consider him a striker in terms of what he chooses to do in the ring. Andre Fialho lost to Jake Matthews back in June. Good power, first and foremost. He's introduced as a boxer. 13 of his 16 wins are via KO, TKO. I have seen him fight out of both stances. He's good at staying in front of you, good at controlling center, good in and out movement, good fakes and feints and head movement to go along with that style. He's pretty composed in his own right, but he is relatively one-dimensional, right? He's going to stay in front of you. He's going to look to strike with you. He's primarily hands at that. He's good at that one dimension, but just doesn't really have many other dimensions to his game. But he does have some ground skills, right? Daniel Cormier gives him legitimate credit for having legitimate wrestling. Even defensively, 75% takedown defense in the UFC, which could be important for this fight for when Salikhov potentially attempts that takedown. I like this fight. I think it's a bit of a clash of styles with respect to the style of striking that each of these fighters are. Muslim Salikhov, more technique, more of a point fighter. Andre Fialho, being that big puncher that's looking to set things up. I think this fight is 50-50 in a lot of ways. What's interesting is that Fialho did not look great in his last fight. He was essentially being outclassed on the feet. That could be very concerning. That was versus Jake Matthews, but that was a pay-per-view event. He's up against, I should say, an opponent this time around whose movement is not as dynamic, who's a little bit more in your face, a little bit more straightforward as a striker, and who won't really resort to the ground game as much. I also think about, on the flip side, Muslim Salikhov's last fight, versus Jingliang Li. Jingliang Li was able to crack Salikhov. He had him hurt badly. Jingliang Li, we know, has power. Andre Fialho definitely has legitimate power. And I could potentially see Fialho cracking him in the same way. I think that Andre Fialho's stalking pressure style, paired along with Salikhov's lack of engagement, lack of proactive engagement, I think that's going to work really well for Andre Fialho. I think that it's going to allow him to get the job done in what could otherwise look like a sparring match. And Fialho potentially gets that knockout. He has that power in him. So I'm looking at Andre Fialho to get it done. Again, Salikhov is getting up there in age. He's showing signs of it on a fight-over-fight basis. And I think he's just in a bad spot here, going up against a guy with a lot of power in Andre Fialho. So I'm counting on Fialho to get that knockout. I wouldn't bet on that prop per se, but I do think it's very possible. Andre Fialho is going to be my pick. Third fight of our main card, we have Chase Sherman versus Waldo Cortes-Acosta. Sherman, he was supposed to fight 2 weeks ago, but that fight was scrapped. He beat Jared Vanderaa back in July. Decent overall stand-up, likes that leg kick. Combinations are clean and diverse, doesn't really overswing, keeps it controlled. Doesn't really have the best striking defense, no real head movement, and doesn't offer much else, right? Doesn't offer much of a ground game. He likes to keep it standing, pretty one-dimensional as well. Waldo Cortes-Acosta, his last fight was also a win versus Jared Vanderaa, but that was less than a month ago. He is a striker. He's a former boxer. He has a good jab. He uses it really well to control distance, to control pace, to set up combinations, as well as to stop the attack of his opponents. He's going to be pretty much all boxing. Don't really expect kicks out of him. He can land solid combinations, doesn't really swing wildly or waste punches in his own right. And, he has been controlled with a clinch takedown approach. Won't matter in this fight. But what's important with that is, even though he's been controlled with that approach in the past, he has shown that even late in a fight, even in a round 3, he can get those combinations strung together and land the KO victory. So definitely has it in him to be dangerous at any given time. I really like the value on Waldo Cortes-Acosta on this one. I think that both fighters are going to get the type of match that they're looking for, a striking match where the ground threat just doesn't really exist. I think for Cortes-Acosta, his striking is a bit cleaner. I think it's faster. I think his footwork is also cleaner and faster. And I think ultimately that's where the difference will be for this fight. We saw Cortes-Acosta have some issues checking that calf kick in his last fight versus Jared Vanderaa. But firstly, I think he's going to learn how to defend it better for as much as a problem as it was, again, just a month ago at this point. And secondly, I don't think Sherman is going to game plan for it necessarily. So I feel pretty good about Waldo Cortes-Acosta here, outside of the fact that it is always a heavyweight beware. Two strikers that have knockout power where either guy can get knocked out in a heavyweight fight. We know exactly what it is from that perspective. But outside of that factor, I really like Cortes-Acosta, higher level striker, former pro boxer. He's going to know what he's doing in there throughout the entirety of the fight. Whereas Sherman, although he is a good striker, I just don't think he's the level of striker that Waldo Cortes-Acosta is. So again, I feel pretty good about Waldo Cortes-Acosta here, outside of the fact that it is still a heavyweight fight. But nonetheless, Waldo Cortes-Acosta will be my pick. Co-main event of the evening. This is in the light heavyweight division. We have Kennedy Nzechukwu taking on Iwan Cutelaba. For Cutelaba, he's on a 2-fight losing streak, lost to Johnny Walker. That was just 2 months ago. He's a finish or be finished type of fighter. He comes forward. He's going to walk you down. He's going to throw a lot into his punches. We know he's very explosive, has legitimate power to go along with it. Also got to respect that he's starting to bring a little bit more IQ to his game rather than just swinging wildly. He's more patient on the feet. He sets things up better. I think he understands for him to be a high-level fighter, these are things that he's going to have to incorporate. He's also incorporating that ground game much more, especially lately. 4.7 takedowns per fight, 63% accuracy. Definitely has a good ground game, a legitimate ground game, legitimate takedown game, and some good ground and pound to go along with it. Kennedy Nzechukwu, on the other hand, much more of a striker. He beat Carl Roberson back in July. He can fight in either stance. He's long. He's going to have an 8-inch reach advantage in this one. He's definitely going to use it. Has that long jab, has that long 1-2 combination down the middle. His stand-up is also improving technically, fight over fight. He's going to stalk you down, expect him to control the center of the octagon, expect him to use fakes and feints along with that jab, or he'll be coming forward as well. Decent movement, improved footwork, not really the most active striker, kind of throws one shot at a time at times, but definitely an improved striker with improved combinations. You can tell that that is something that he's working on. His striking is definitely looking sharper. What's important here for this fight is that Kennedy Nzechukwu has legitimate takedown defense, 81% takedown defense on paper, but also has the IQ in terms of how to defend the takedown. His last fight, he showed his offensive ability on the ground as well, which could introduce a really interesting layer in this one, although a very different type of opponent in Nzechukwu's last fight, going up against Carl Roberson. Both of these fighters, pretty good, but pretty unreliable from a betting perspective. And I think it's because you don't really know what version of fighter is going to show up that day. What version of Cutelaba is going to show up that day? When he's on, he's dangerous. What version of Kennedy Nzechukwu is going to show up that day? When he's on, sky's the limit in terms of his potential, right? Nzechukwu, has a few legitimate attempts in terms of going for that neck, going for the submission. Cutelaba got choked out in his last fight. So again, I talked about that interesting additional layer that could potentially happen with some of the offensive ground game that Nzechukwu was showing in his last fight, albeit much different opponent. Outside of that, I think that Nzechukwu has a few key advantages on the feet, including that 8-inch reach. Definitely going to be able to keep Cutelaba at range with it. What's unreliable about Kennedy Nzechukwu is that slow start. It's something that he's acknowledged, right? The lack of activity at times. He allows his opponents to dictate pace. So even though he has the advantage on the feet, I think about Nzechukwu's last fight versus, or 2 fights ago, I believe it was, versus Nick Niguramanu. And I think about Niguramanu being able to back up Nzechukwu on the feet throughout the fight. I think about Niguramanu being able to use that clinch against the cage and threaten that takedown throughout the fight. And I think Cutelaba's ability to potentially do the same exists for this fight. To that point, Cutelaba has the better ground game, including that clinch situation. And I think that's ultimately where the difference in this fight will be. I think Kennedy Nzechukwu is going to kind of fall into old habits, allow Cutelaba to dictate the pace, allow Cutelaba to put a better pressure on him, and put himself in clinch situations and maybe not be taken down because Nzechukwu has legitimate takedown defense, but cage control time in some ways is just as good. It is a close fight. Either fighter can knock the other one out. And Nzechukwu has the striking advantage, so I can understand why he is the favorite. But in my opinion, I think Cutelaba has more realistic ways to win this fight if I'm looking at some of the tendencies and the habits of each of these fighters. So for our co-main event, I'm actually going with the underdog, Iwan Cutelaba at plus 150. Let's look at our main event now. We have Derrick Lewis versus Sergey Spivak. Derrick Lewis on a 2-fight losing streak. He lost to Sergey Pavlovich back in July. I mean, we know the Derrick Lewis script at this point. I don't have to take too much time breaking him down as a fighter. We know he's a big striker, patient striker, has that touch of death power, especially as a counterpuncher. If you overcommit, he will catch you. He controls the center of the octagon, looks for that big right hand. Doesn't really have the best chin, especially as he gets older. Doesn't really have the best heart or will to win either. When he is rocked, he's willing to kind of call it a day and say, you know what, I'll get him next time. Once he's in a compromised position, he's either going to land that Hail Mary bomb, big right hand, or the fight's going to be over very soon because he's going to get finished. Sergey Spivak's on a 2-fight winning streak by comparison. Both of those wins were via ground and pound. Interesting to note. He beat Augusto Sakai back in August. He's a combat sambo fighter. The striking is looking cleaner on a fight-by-fight basis. Solid jab, solid striking speed, good timing. He finds those takedown opportunities regardless of how much bigger you are than him. Usually opponents outweigh him by at least 15 pounds on the scale and maybe more than that come fight time. But he finds those takedown opportunities. He has good chain wrestling, a good clinch against the cage. If he gets you down, good top position. And again, doesn't matter if you're 15, 20 pounds heavier than him, he has that ability to keep guys down with that relentless smothering wrestling approach. Spivak, again, he's been smothering his opponents, especially lately. He's been aggressive. He's gone straight to that takedown approach. And the chain wrestling, the striking is also starting to stand out. I can see Spivak implement the exact same game plan that he did in his last fight versus Augusto Sakai. He was coming forward. His offense with the striking was consistent with the pace. He was going straight for the takedowns and landing those takedowns to avoid the striking threat coming back his way. The ground and pound was relentless as Augusto Sakai was making his way back up, which we know Derrick Lewis can do just with the brute strength that he has. Spivak was chaining those takedowns together, or at least staying on your back, which again, that clinch control time in some ways is just as meaningful. And on top of that, that clinch control drains on the cardio tank. We know Derrick Lewis doesn't have the best cardio tank. He admits to not even liking 5-round fights, and this is exactly that. The equalizer, of course, is Derrick Lewis's power. I mentioned Derrick Lewis last week when I was breaking down the Adesanya fight, and I'll mention it again. Derrick Lewis will always be losing in his fights until he lands that big shot, if he does. From a betting perspective, I just can't trust that to be your only weapon. Win, lose, or draw, right? I can't trust that to be your only weapon. Otherwise, I think that Spivak is better almost everywhere. I think Spivak is on the incline whereas Lewis is on the decline, right? I think Spivak will go to the wrestling right away to avoid that early threat, wear on Lewis a little bit. Derrick Lewis has just 55% takedown defense, while Spivak lands 4 takedowns a fight. So statistically, Lewis should see the mat in this fight due to a Sergey Spivak takedown. I feel pretty comfortable picking Sergey Spivak here. Again, outside of that big shot landing from Derrick Lewis, which is very possible. And I said the same thing last week. And I've also gotten my last 2 main events incorrect. So this could very well be one of those situations. But I do believe Sergey Spivak has more chances to win this fight, more ways to win this fight, especially as a 5-rounder. I think he's the much smarter pick. If Derrick Lewis is going to get it done, it's going to be in the first 2 rounds, a common theme that I've mentioned for main events over the last 3 weeks now. If Lewis wins, it is going to be in the first 2 rounds. Otherwise, I feel very good about Sergey Spivak walking away with this one. Sergey Spivak is going to be my pick, by the way. And again, feeling pretty good about that outside of the big bomb landing from Derrick Lewis. Let's take it to Vegas. Let's see what we got on the boards from a betting perspective. And let's consider some underdogs here. I'll kind of speak freely. I don't really know where I'm going yet. Vanessa Demopoulos is a pick'em fight. I have Vanessa Demopoulos in that one. So technically, that's a good underdog pick. I think Kevin Natividad could be a good underdog pick. I think Jennifer Maia has some value as an underdog. I think Andre Fialho as a pick'em fight has some value as well. But ultimately, where my underdog pick that I feel has the best shot at winning is going to come from is going to be our co-main event. Iwan Cutelaba versus Kennedy Nzechukwu. Again, I really like the tools that Cutelaba has to offer in this one. If he is at a high level, then I think he has the opportunity to get it done here. That's going to be a 2.4, more than double your money. So pretty solid underdog pick there. Now, in terms of favorite picks, I am sticking with the main card. Difficult card, a lot of close fights, but the main card does provide some opportunities, in my opinion. I think one of those opportunities is Jack Della Maddalena. I think one of those opportunities is Waldo Cortes-Acosta. I feel pretty good about those 2. The third fight, I feel good about, but there is legitimate threat from the opponent. And that, again, is our main event, Sergey Spivak. Those 3 fights would be a 2.87. What that means is that $100 will return $287. And for our bigger bettors, $250 will return $718. But let's officially sign off on that note. I'm curious to know how the listeners feel about these picks. So I want to hear from you in the comments. Let me know what your favorite picks are, what your underdog picks are, what your potential parlay is looking like. After you comment, make sure you hit the thumbs up on this video if you have not done so already. Definitely want to get some traction going for this one. And also make sure you subscribe to the channel here at Boxing MMA Picks. But again, in our usual fashion, this has been the full card prediction video for UFC Fight Night, Derrick Lewis versus Sergey Spivak. And in our usual fashion, let's get this money.